Today I'm going to take a look at PBS or Proxmox Backup Server. So PBS works as a full backup solution for your Proxmox virtualization systems. And compared to the old solution that they had, which was just to create a little image in Proxmox, it's a lot better of a backup solution. It can do incrementals, it can do easily remove old backups, it can kind of keep only what backups you want, it can also back up arbitrary files on a Debian-based system, and it's overall a pretty good solution in my opinion. But I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into the interface, what I like about it, what I think could be improved about it, and just some other thoughts I have about PBS. So what is PBS for? So Proxmox really hasn't had a great backup solution until PBS came out. Originally it had their backup solution, which if I take a look at it on a Proxmox system here, I can run backups and it essentially would just capture a full image of that system. And it'll compress it with the config file. And this can be nice still if you want to migrate between systems, but it had a few downsides. First of all, it was only full of backups. So if you wanted to back up, let's say 100 gig VM for a week, that's 700 gigs of backups. Whereas if incrementals, it might only be like 150 or 200 gigs of backups because it only stores those changes every other day. And PBS does have incremental backups like that, so it's much more efficient with storage space. The other thing was, because it was a full backup, it was slow. It has to read all the data and then write all the compressed data. A lot of other backup solutions like Veeam and PBS only look at the changed blocks. So they look at it, says, hey, this is a map of changed blocks, so for a VM of 100 gigs, maybe only 1 or 2 gigs have changed, so it only needs to back up those 1 or 2 gigs because it can assume everything else is perfectly the same because it keeps track of what's been changing on disk. And because Proxmox is a relatively small player in the field, Veeam and other commercial solutions haven't really made a Proxmox version. So you really didn't have another great option until PBS came out to do good backups. And because of that, I saw that as one kind of downside of Proxmox, there wasn't really a great solution. And luckily, they've built one now. It works really well with Proxmox. It's pretty much plug and play, and it uses a lot of the same interface and design that you're used to if you're using the standard Proxmox virtualization interface with it. Now, you don't have to use Proxmox VE with it, but it's a little bit odd, because Proxmox Backup Server is designed to back up your containers, your VMs, and then you can back up arbitrary data in a Debian-based system with a client. And this can be nice for something like a NAS, but really if you're doing heavy NAS use or something else, you might want to look at other backup solutions than PBS. But if you already have a PBS system, it might be nice to just add something else, and I'm glad they added that in. On my list of wants, I'd love to see like a Windows client and maybe like a CentOS 2. It'd be cool if you could kind of use it to back up everything. I'd be super happy if they made it for other hypervisors too, but I think just having more support in the client would be great. With that out of the way, let's take a look at the interface of PBS. So on my screen right now, I have the dashboard of a PBS system. So I see a few things. First of all, I just see system info, like what CPU I have, what version it's running, my usage on this system. Because it's not doing any backups right now, my utilization is very low on here. It's not doing anything. I see the longest tasks, which I can click to open and view the task here, and it says, that's all the data that's been done. And it shows me if there's been an error on tasks. A summary of all the failed tasks, so I can look at a failed task and see what happened. One thing I wish it would do was highlight better what the error was. Some of these aren't too bad, but some of these, like I believe this one here that had a warning, you get this really long list and it doesn't highlight it. I think it would be cool if it highlighted the row here in like yellow or red, whatever the color goes with it would be, to say like this is the warning one here, and it might. Or maybe just when you open it here, it shows the warning here on this menu as well. I think just a way to better see the warnings would be kind of neat. A lot of these errors you see here are from my testing of here, because I kind of pushed the software to its limits during my testing. You should see less errors than this if you're running it in a production environment. It's been pretty solid in my use overall. Next thing, data store usage. So this is your list of data stores that you have, how big they are, how much data you've used, how much available space, percentage, and estimated full. So what it'll do is if you make new backups, it'll estimate when it'll fill all the way up. So then you know how much time you have remaining, which is cool, because then you can know how to set it up so that it never fills up. And I like the little graph they have of usage too. It's kind of nice to see I filled it all the way up, and then it's kind of sat at about the same since then. Running tasks, if you have any, it's currently idle, so I don't have anything. And then no subscription. So I can pay for a subscription and get paid support and the full repository for it, but I have currently not done that on this system right here. And then I can look a little bit more at the configuration through some of these tabs. So this is going to be very familiar if you've used Proxmox VE very much. It's a lot of the similar style UI, user interface, a lot of the same style user management, and then you get remotes. So remotes you can set up are essentially a second system, a second PBS system it will sync to. So it'll sync all the data that you've backed up onto one system to another system. And that's great for having something like an offsite backup. And in my use, I have a co-located server that's connected via VPN that I have it so it's syncing all my backups over that connection. And it's smart, so it only syncs the changes you've made and doesn't sync everything. So that's one really cool thing. I'm going to get a little bit more into the remote setup in a bit. Traffic control lets you limit the speed of remotes and the max speed that they can transfer at. Certificates and subscriptions if you have any. Administration lets you access a shell of the system, so essentially just a local command prompt. And then storage and disks. So this is for the actual physical disks on the system. So this system here is using ZFS to manage the RAID and volume management and everything. So you'll see here, I have a lot of these ZFS drives. It'll tell you if they've passed SMART, what their serial numbers are on all my drives. And I can see I have a ZFS pool here. Everything's online, and it's set up here. I can also use this to create ZFS in the menu here, and ZFS seems to be the suggested way of managing multiple drives. Otherwise, you can do whatever you want on Linux to set up drives. So I can add an arbitrary directory in Linux and make it a storage for PBS. So if I wanted to use like MDADM or another file system, I could do that here. And then tape backup. So I don't have a tape drive to play with, so I can't really comment on it, but it does say it supports tapes and will put your backups on tapes if you want it to. Data stores lets you manage your data stores and which data stores are being used. So I get a summary here if I look at data stores. And then if I click on the data store, this is where you get, I'd say, a lot of the options I want to look at and poke at. So now I'm going to take a look at the main data store in the system I'm storing most of my data on. So on the summary page, I can just see a summary of the data store. So that's great. I get a nice little summary of the utilization, graphs of like IOPS, transfer rate, utilization. I get to see how much is stored on it, how much usage is. But I think it really starts to get cool when you look at content. So I've backed up everything on here, so I can look at like VM 100. And that's where I see all of my different VM snapshots from it. It looks like I had it every 2 hours for this VM. It's up to 32 gigs. And then I can see the data in it. So it has a log file, it has the actual image, the index, and then the commute server, which is the configuration file for that VM. So it has each one of those in every one of these, and then this is deduplicated so it doesn't actually use the full space. And then at the top, I get an option to verify all, or I can do it here for verify. I can change owner for permissions, and then I can prune it. So pruning basically lets me take a VM which has a lot of snapshots of different times and only keep some of them. So I don't have a great example here, but I can say keep hourly of the last like 4 hours. So it'll keep me the last hourly backups from the last 4. I don't have enough examples to look at other ones, but it's super cool that they actually tell you which ones it keeps and which ones it doesn't. But right now I'm going to only keep the last one to show how it works. So now I have it pruning, so it's going to delete all the chunks from the ones that aren't needed. I'm going to talk a little bit more on how chunks work in a little bit. And actually that task I believe was super fast, but it won't actually delete it from disk until you run garbage collection, which actually deletes the files from the disk. So let's take a look at that now. One other thing to note before I look at that is that I can see I have a few icons. So this little cube means a container. The little kind of PC, Mac, desktop thing means VM. And then the little tower means a host VM. So that's that arbitrary data backup. So I was just using it to back up my main host, in this name Brandon Server 5, and I had a directory. So I had this PXAR directory where it puts everything together, and in this case it's 4.3 terabytes. So garbage collection is where it goes and actually marks which chunks aren't needed and removes them. So now that I've talked a little bit about chunks, let's take a look at how Proxmox Backup Server stores the data on disk. So a lot of backup software like Veeam and others will make a full backup the first time you run a backup and every once in a while, and then it'll make incremental backups. So it'll take a look at that full backup, the current state of the VM, and make a little file of all the changes. And that works pretty well depending on your use case, but it has a few disadvantages, which is if you want to keep one arbitrary V state, you have to keep all the other versions in that series. It can also make deleting old ones kind of a pain, so if you want to keep one from like a year ago, you might have to keep a whole chain of the last month before that year ago one if you want that arbitrary backup. So the chunk storage works a little bit differently. Instead of having a big image or something like that, it splits it into little chunks. So in this example I made right here, my first VM state needs 10 different chunks. My VM state 2 needs 10 chunks too, but 2 of those chunks are different and it doesn't need 2 of the original ones. And then on disk it's storing 12 chunks because it has the original 10 and then the 2 more that are needed. And what garbage collection can do, and pruning, is it tells it, hey, if you want to prune it, maybe we don't need the state 2 right now. So then we can delete the extra 2 on disk. So it takes a little bit of time, it looks at which ones it needs, and then it marks some for deletion, and then it actually goes and deletes them. These chunks are typically up to 4 megs in size, but on average it seems to be about 1.4 to 1.7 megs in my use case. But it really depends on what exactly your VMs are and how they're being stored. So if I take a look at the screen now, it's marking which chunks it doesn't need, and then it's looking at the unused ones, and will start to delete those unused chunks to actually save you the disk space. Now the big disadvantage of this compared to the more traditional full backup and incremental is this can take quite a while. I've done some timing depending on the size of the VM, but it can take multiple hours on a slower system like I have running on PBS, and with large backups it's going to take quite a while. So if you're doing tens or hundreds of terabytes of backups, you're going to probably want to do some estimation of how long it's going to take for you to do it. For just a couple of terabytes like I have here, it's reasonably fast, but you just want to make sure that this is a reasonable solution for you and the amount of time it takes to process this. The great thing is this is quite a bit more efficient disk space wise compared to the full and incremental because it only stores what it needs. So if you only need the last like 1 month and then a couple from the last week and then everything from the last hour, it only stores that. And here taking a look, it actually shows my summary. So it says it removed 42 gigs of garbage, which was likely that VM I just pruned. It removed 32,000 chunks. It was originally using 33 terabytes. So this 33 terabytes is the unduplicated, deduplicated chunk of data. But because of deduplication of 5.34 times, it only needs 6.2 TB of data. And the average chunk size in this case is actually 3.3 megabytes. So it's a maximum of 4 megabytes, I believe. And I've just saved a little bit of disk space. The next tab here is sync jobs. So this is where if you have a remote system, you can sync it to the remote system. So let's take a look at one of my other systems that has a sync job going. So this is another copy of PBS running right now. And this copy of PBS is running in my co-located server somewhere else connected via VPN. I've added it remotely under remotes here so I can see that this has a remote host. And then I've added under the data stores a sync job with this system. So I have it connected here and I said every hour I want you to go copy it as fast as you can. And because I don't have the fastest connection with this system, I can see that it's ran some relatively slow jobs and it'll just copy all the snapshots. So it'll copy only the changes that it needs to copy, so it's relatively efficient when it comes to time and changes. And it essentially will compare the list of chunks that it has on the remote system with the local chunks and just make sure that it has everything it needs remotely. So that's pretty nice that it only copies what it needs and it's fairly efficient. And the big thing I get from PBS's design is that it's generally pretty darn efficient when it comes to the amount of data it has, the data it needs to copy, and the amount of file space it uses on disk, which I like being someone who doesn't want to have a ton of extra disk space. The next option is verified jobs. So a verified job will just do a read and checksum. So this just makes sure you don't have any silent file corruption or any issues with it after it's been copied or synced or anything. So in this one, I can click the little V button. It'll run a verified job. And this is something you probably want to run automatically, and I have an easy way to set it up to run it maybe every week just to make sure there's no disk issues or anything here. So in this case, I had a small container and it looks like everything's doing okay. And I can set up a verified job easily to say, hey, maybe every Saturday at, in the evening, and I'm going to re-verify after 30 days. So that way, if it sees it's been verified already recently, it's going to assume it's fine. And then I have options, which lets me notify users in case something happens, and then verify if new snapshots are created. And then I have a permissions tab, which lets me set up permissions if I had multiple users. And this works just like Proxmox, where you can have groups and assign permissions to groups and say different users can access different data stores. So let's talk about one of the most important parts about backup, which is just restoring it so you can access the data that you've backed up before. So there's a few different ways to do that, some of which is in the Proxmox VE interface and some of which is in the PBS interface. So let's take a look at both right now. And I'm going to be using this VM 109, which is just kind of my test Windows 11 system right now for doing that. So if I look at content, I can see I have VM 109 and I have a few different snapshots from pretty recently that I could look at. So if I want, I can actually just take it and I can download this image file here. And it's a compressed image and I can just save it. It's going to download me as actually the uncompressed option. And it's going to take a little bit of time to download, but now I have an image file that if I want, I can put into another hypervisor. I can do whatever I want with. I could extract here. I'm not going to do that now because it's going to take a while to download, but it's just an image file of the virtual disk that it has. I can also see the config file here, so if I want to download this config file, I can then view my conf file here, and if I want, I can open it in something like Notepad. And it's just a config file that it uses Proxmox to say, hey, this is what hardware I gave it. So if I want to restore it onto another system, these are probably the files I want. But if I want to restore it on the same Proxmox host or a different host, I can do a few things. And the two ways to do it is, first of all, going into the actual VM, and then go to backup here, and then I can see my backups. If you don't see anything, make sure the correct storage is listed, because otherwise it won't see anything. So I can say, hey, maybe I want the one from 1704. So I can click restore. It'll restore it over the same VM, so it'll overwrite what you have. And then I get a few options of if I want to start it right afterwards, or if I want to do a live restore. And a live restore means instead of waiting for the backup to finish, it'll immediately start the VM using the data in the backup, and then it'll start it. So I'm going to actually try doing that right now. So it'll actually erase anything the VM has after that state and overwrite it with what your backup is. So you might want to be careful with doing it this way. Also, it's running right now, so I'm going to have to stop my VM first to make sure that I can actually restore the backup. And once my VM has stopped, I can now run this restore job here, restore, and I'm going to do that live restore right now. And it's going to overwrite my current VM with the content and immediately start running it from the actual backup data. And then once it finishes the backup, it'll start running it from the new one. So I can see it's starting to restore the disk right now. And it should have the VM running very soon. And actually, yeah, the VM is running right now. So even though the backup restore just started a few seconds ago, I actually have a usable VM that's booted up right now or is starting to boot at this current moment. The other thing I can do is restore the backup into a different VM that started from that state. And I'll keep the original VM if I want to have both copies. So the way I can do this is by going into the data storage I have here, clicking on the VM I want to restore in the period in time. So in this case, let's use a different one, a slightly older copy. And I'm going to click restore. And I'm going to store it as a new VM, in this case 114. And it's just going to be onto whatever the storage it was using before is. I can do the same live restore. Unique will regenerate things like the MAC address and other unique variables for that VM. And maybe I'll have this one start right after the restore finishes too. So now I've restored the backup into a new VM, so I haven't overwritten anything. So this can be nice if you have a VM that's gone into a weird state you don't want, but you want to be able to still restore stuff. So maybe it had ransomware or something. You're going to still try to restore from the ransomware because you want to make sure if you get anything you can. But otherwise, you still have your latest state. So it's nice that they have both options here. And it's just going to take a little bit to restore this VM and get it running. And the other great thing is I can mount this PBS share onto another system, view these same VMs I have here, and restore them onto my other system, which can kind of be a nice way to do an offline migration or something like that. But if migration's your goal, I do more of the traditional backup onto like maybe an external drive, move the drive or network share over, and then restore from there. PBS is more for kind of an ongoing backup and less of kind of a move between systems type of backup. So now that I've talked a bit about the user interface and some of the features that PBS has, let's talk about how I use PBS for what I back up. So I have a Proxmox virtual environment system running with quite a few of my different VMs I use for different personal home lab tasks. I have some VMs that I see as more important than others, things like a lot of my personal data that I sync from my documents and downloads folders, and some are just the more things that I want to keep the data more. Those things are backed up to a local PBS system running on my actual virtualization host, because I wanted to try it as one of the options is to run it on the virtualization host or any other Debian system. I just installed the packages and it works fine, and I back it up on there and I back it up to another little ZFS array on my main virtualization server. The nice thing of this is I can have it share the same array really easily. This instance running on my main system is then synced with my co-located instance. So I just have a remote job running, they're connected via VPN, and it just syncs the data every hour so that my co-located always has the most recent copies of my very important VMs synced to it. And this sync's been pretty reliable, pretty solid, haven't really had to worry about anything, and it just kind of works. I'm quite happy with how PBS works in this instance. I then have another system that backs up all my VMs and all of my data to it locally. This system I leave off a lot of the time just to save power consumption. And this system is that EMC Isilon I've taken a look at earlier. It's a pretty solid older dual 1366 server running dual L5630s, 24 gigs of RAM, and is more than plenty for running PBS here. It has a total of about 24 terabytes usable of storage, and I use that to back up all my VMs, and then I also use the data store backup in PBS to back up some of my NAS stores. So I have a video project stores that videos like these end up on, and some of my personal photo projects and other video projects. And then I also have just a backup of all kind of my storage data that I have for other uses that backs up to that system. There's a bit more manual setup as I like to shut it down to save power when possible, but other than that it's pretty darn solid and backs up quite quickly using the incremental backups. This is my relatively simple PBS system that I use that works quite well for what my little home lab use case is. Now that I've gone over how I use it, let's go over some of my kind of wants, feature requests, and things like that that I have for PBS and some of the issues I've ran into. I really can't replicate any major issues or crashes. It's been a pretty solid product for me and ran very reliably in my use case. A few one-off issues, but when I tried to replicate the issues, I couldn't really replicate them, so I'm not going to comment about them now as I'm just assuming it's something weird happening, and they were pretty rare overall in my use case of PBS 2.1. Now on the things I want, some of those are a progress bar for sync jobs. It just kind of says it's syncing and maybe how many chunks. I'd love to see like a percentage and like maybe a little progress bar of an estimated time remaining. I believe it does a global lock when you do the VM backups instead of a per VM lock. I am not fully sure of how it's doing, but it'd be cool if it could do a per VM lock instead of a global lock. So then that way you can have multiple backup jobs running on one virtualization host at the same time, which is great if you have a lot of large VMs you want to back up at the same time. Another thing I'd like to see improved is how it does multiple incremental backups. So one thing I've noticed is it seems like you have to have one job run multiple times for it to actually have the incrementals working, and it has to be a running VM. If the VM is shut down, it always runs a full backup and reads all the data. I'd love for it to fix that, but you can kind of get around that by just putting those in a different job that runs less, as you likely don't need to back up shut down VMs as often. But it's just a little messy, and something like Veeam can do this. And the other thing is, if you have a backup job running, run a different backup job to a different storage device, and then run that original backup job again, it has to recreate the changed thing, so it has to do a full backup and can't just do an incremental. So if there's some way to make it just keep a separate incremental data for multiple backup jobs, that would be cool. And sometimes what I've done is have like a backup job to one solution to another. But then again, PBS has a solution of syncs. So then you don't really need as much of a backup jobs there. So for a lot of VMs, if you just only have one backup job, that's not really an issue. But if you want to back it up to multiple locations, that is something I'd like for them to see improvement. I'd like a better way of showing job errors, as I showed earlier. I'd like it to just maybe highlight the line that has the error or something in, just make it pop out a little bit more. And the other thing I'd like to see is that the Proxmox Backup client on systems, some sort of way of showing progress, either on the web interface here or on the terminal command line, just show like a percentage done, something like maybe how Borg works, where it can show you with the progress or stats option. For the backup client, another thing I'd like to see is just a way that Borg works is to just ignore files that it's already backed up. It appears to do a full read of all the files and compares it no matter what. But if it could compare like the date, time, and say, hey, says it's been unchanged, just trust that the file system says it's unchanged, and it is, and don't back up that file. And then, of course, a faster way to do a garbage collection would be great, but I believe that's pretty system limited, as it seems to be limited by disk I/O and CPU here. although it probably could be slightly faster. Overall, I think it's a pretty good solution for backups. Unfortunately, there really isn't anything to compare it with because other commercial solutions like Veeam and stuff don't work on Proxmox. But I think it's pretty feature complete to what Veeam would do on another hypervisor, and there's nothing major I'd say is missing. I think it kind of definitely checks the box for me for a good backup solution that stores it efficiently, is easy to manage, and keep what data you need. There's no major omissions feature-wise that I think I'm missing or would complain about, so I'm pretty darn happy with what it's given me. And I think it continues to make Proxmox, and I'm happy that they keep putting work into developing it and continue to making it a great hypervisor. And it's just, I'd say, pretty on par in a lot of ways with the other large commercial options. So I'm quite happy using it. And let me know if you're using Proxmox Backup Server, what your thoughts are, and if you want to keep using it, or if you have any other complaints that you'd like to see changed or improved.